The city's most exclusive restaurant, L'Étoile Filante, glittered under the Friday night sky. For one woman, it was a sanctuary of hope, a place to celebrate an anniversary and save a marriage she feared was slipping away. 7 months pregnant, she clutched a small gift-wrapped box, her heart full of memories. But just a few tables away, another woman wore a brand-new diamond necklace, a gift from the very same man. He was whispering promises to his mistress, completely unaware that his entire world, his billion-dollar empire, his reputation, and the life of his unborn child was about to shatter in the time it took to order a glass of champagne. This isn't just a story of infidelity. It's a story of how a woman's quiet pain can become a billionaire's public ruin. The weight of the Arlington name was heavier than the 7-carat diamond on Gemma Arlington's finger. It was a name synonymous with old money, ruthless acquisitions, and a veneer of philanthropic grace that glossed over the family's predatory business tactics. Tonight, however, she wasn't Mrs. Arlington, the elegant socialite who chaired charity galas. She was just Jen, a woman trying to anchor her drifting husband, Declan. She checked her reflection in the gilded mirror of their penthouse hallway. The midnight blue silk gown was custom-made, designed to celebrate, not conceal, the gentle swell of her pregnancy. At 7 months, she felt both powerful and fragile, a vessel for a new life that was meant to be the cement in the foundations of their marriage, their son, a Arlington heir. "You look breathtaking," Phoebe said from the doorway, her best friend's voice a mixture of admiration and concern. "Are you sure about this? He's been so distant." Gemma turned, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. "That's why tonight is important. It's our anniversary, Phoebes. Not the wedding one, the other one, the real one." She touched her stomach. "The 8th anniversary of our first date, right here at L'Étoile Filante. He can't have forgotten that. This is our place." Phoebe's silence was answer enough. Declan forgot everything that didn't have a dollar sign attached to it. He said he had a late-night merger meeting with the board from Singapore. Gemma continued more to convince herself than Phoebe. He was so apologetic. "But I'm going to go anyway. I'll order his favorite wine sit at our table, and when he's done, his assistant will tell him where I am. It's romantic, a surprise. Or a recipe for a lonely dinner," Phoebe muttered, earning a soft glare. Okay. I hope it's everything you want it to be. Just guard your heart, Jennen." Gemma picked up the small, heavy box from the mahogany table. Inside was a vintage Patek Philippe watch, one Declan had admired in a Geneva auction catalogue months ago. It was a piece of their history, a nod to a time when he looked at her with the same passion he now reserved for stock tickers. "He'll come," she whispered. Meanwhile, across town, Declan Arlington was fastening a necklace around a different woman's neck. The stones weren't diamonds of history and commitment, but of fire and immediacy, a spontaneous $1 million piece he'd bought that afternoon. "Declan, it's too much." Cassandra Reed gasped, though her hands were already tracing the intricate platinum setting. Her reflection in the mirror of her sleek, modern apartment, paid for by Declan, showed a woman in her late 20s, sharp, ambitious, with eyes that held none of Gemma's gentle weariness. She was dressed in a crimson dress that was a bold statement of intent. "Nothing is too much for you," Cassie Declan said, his voice a low murmur against her ear. He breathed in her perfume, a scent that was all sharp citrus and spice, a stark contrast to Gemma's soft floral signature. With Cassie, he wasn't a Arlington heir carrying the weight of a dynasty. He was just a man desired for who he wasn't what he represented. Or so he told himself. "But where are we going that deserves this?" she asked, turning to face him. You said it was a special night. I have a table at l'Étoile Filante, he said smoothly, ignoring the flicker of a memory, the ghost of a younger, more earnest version of himself, sitting at that very same restaurant with Gemma 8 years ago. He'd compartmentalized his life so effectively that the memory felt like it belonged to someone else. That was business. This was pleasure. The l'Étoile. I thought you could only get a table there if you booked months in advance or were literal royalty. He gave her a wolfish grin. I am Declan Arlington. That's better than royalty. He had in fact called his concierge and demanded they pull whatever strings necessary, leveraging his name and his colossal restaurant spending to secure a last-minute cancellation. A private corner booth, perfect for an intimate celebration. A celebration of what exactly? He hadn't defined it. It was a celebration of the feeling of being alive that Cassie gave him. As Declan's driver navigated the city traffic, Gemma's was pulling up to the restaurant's grand entrance. The doorman, a familiar face named Lewis, greeted her warmly. Mrs. Arlington. A pleasure. We have your usual table ready. Thank you, Lewis. I'm expecting my husband to join me a little later. A business meeting ran over. Of course, let me show you the way. The restaurant was a symphony of hushed elegance. Low lighting, the gentle clink of silverware on porcelain, the murmur of discreet conversations. It was a bubble of wealth and privilege, a world away from reality. Gemma was led to Table 7, a secluded alcove with a perfect view of the restaurant's famous starlit ceiling. Their table. She settled in the baby, giving a gentle kick as if in approval. She smiled a genuine, hopeful smile. She ordered a bottle of the 2005 Chateau Margaux, Declan's favorite, and asked the waiter to decant it. It would be breathing perfectly by the time he arrived. 30 minutes later, Declan and Cassie were led through the main dining room. The maître d'Antoine was the soul of discretion. He guided them not towards the main floor, but along a raised perimeter, towards a different private booth, one shielded by lush ferns and intricate woodwork. It was close to the alcove where Gemma was sitting, but offered the illusion of complete privacy. It's beautiful, Declan Cassie whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of genuine awe and the thrill of social climbing. Only the best, he said, taking her hand. He felt a surge of power, of control. He had it all. The perfect pregnant wife, at home securing his legacy. The exciting, passionate mistress here, stoking his ego. He had mastered the universe. Gemma swirled the deep red wine in her glass, its aroma filling her senses. She checked her phone. No messages. She felt a familiar prickle of disappointment, but pushed it down. Mergers were complicated. She understood. She picked up the menu, though she already knew what she would order for both of them. And then she heard it. A laugh. It wasn't the sound itself, but the timbre, a high, sharp burst of joy that cut through the restaurant's polite hum. It was a woman's laugh, but it was the man's response, a low, intimate chuckle that made the hairs on Gemma's arms stand up. It sounded like Declan. She told herself she was being foolish. There were hundreds of men in the city with a similar laugh. She was just lonely and on edge. She took a sip of water, her hand trembling slightly. She looked around the restaurant, her gaze sweeping past celebrating couples and serious-faced businessmen. Her eyes snagged on a flash of crimson in a booth she hadn't noticed before, partially obscured by a large fern. She saw the back of a man's head. The dark, perfectly coiffed hair was unmistakable. The set of his shoulders in the bespoke Tom Ford suit was as familiar to her as her own reflection. And seated across from him was a woman with fiery auburn hair, her head tilted back as she laughed again. Around her neck, a cascade of diamonds glittered, catching the low light and throwing it back like a starburst. a new necklace. Time seemed to warp, stretching and thinning until it snapped. The ambient noise of the restaurant faded into a dull, distant roar, like the sound of the ocean heard from inside a seashell. Gemma's world narrowed to that one table. Her husband, Declan. He wasn't in a late-night merger meeting with the Singapore board. He was here, in their restaurant, on their anniversary, with another woman. The blood drained from her face. The baby in her womb, sensing her distress, gave a sharp, painful kick, a sudden jolt that brought a gasp to her lips. She placed a hand on her stomach, a purely instinctual gesture of protection. Every happy memory of this place, every hopeful fantasy she had built for the evening, crumbled into dust, leaving behind a cold, hard shard of betrayal that lodged itself directly in her heart. He hadn't just forgotten. He had actively, cruelly replaced her. For a long moment, Gemma was frozen, a statue carved from ice and shock. Her mind reeled, trying to process the impossible tableau before her. Denial was the first wave to crash over her. It was a mistake, a look-alike, a cruel trick of the light. But the way he leaned forward, the intimate angle of his body towards the woman, the proprietary smile on his face as he watched her speak it, was all Declan. Every gesture, every nuance was a dagger. Her first instinct was primal to flee, to run from the restaurant, from the humiliation, from the truth, to curl up in her bed and let the world dissolve. But then a different feeling began to smolder in the pit of her stomach, a slow burning rage that was foreign and terrifyingly powerful. It was the protective fury of a mother. This man hadn't just betrayed her, he had betrayed their child. He was toasting to a new love while the vessel of his legacy sat just yards away alone. No, she would not run. She would not be the weeping, hysterical wife. She had given this man 8 years of her life, her loyalty, her body. She was Arlington now, and she would act like one. With a poise she didn't know she possessed, she gathered herself. Her movements were deliberate, almost unnaturally calm. She placed her napkin neatly on the table beside her untouched glass of wine. Then she stood up. The journey from her alcove to his booth felt like a mile-long walk across a field of broken glass. With each step, she felt the eyes of other diners on her, drawn to the silent, regal procession of the heavily pregnant woman in the midnight blue gown. She kept her chin high, her gaze locked on the back of her husband's head. Declan was in his element, regaling Cassie with a story of a corporate takeover, embellishing the details to make himself sound like a modern-day conqueror. He lifted his glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the light. And that, he said with a smirk, is how you turn a rival into a subsidiary. Cassie was captivated. You're incredible. She breathed her hand, reaching across the table to cover his. It was at that precise moment that a shadow fell over them. It is an impressive story, a quiet voice said. Declan's head snapped up. The confident smirk on his face evaporated, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. His blood ran cold. Standing before him, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly, was Gemma. She looked like an avenging angel, her face pale but her eyes burning with a cold, clear fire he had never seen before. "Gemma," he stammered, his voice a strangled whisper. He snatched his hand back from Cassie's as if he'd been burned. What are you doing here?" Cassie stared, her mouth slightly agape. She looked from Declan's horrified face to the pregnant woman standing over them. Confusion warred with indignation. Who was this, an XA business associate? Gemma's gaze didn't even flicker towards Cassie. Her eyes were locked on her husband, pinning him to his seat. "What am I doing here, Declan? I should ask you the same thing. I believe your merger meeting was at the office." Did the Singapore board decide to relocate to our table? The sarcasm was delivered with surgical precision, each word a perfectly aimed scalpel. It's not what it looks like, he managed the classic pathetic refrain of the guilty man. Oh, I think it is exactly what it looks like, Gemma replied, her voice dangerously soft. She finally allowed her eyes to drift to Cassie, a slow, dismissive appraisal that took in the crimson dress, the ambitious glint in her eyes, and the gaudy necklace. She looked at Cassie not as a rival, but as an unfortunate, predictable cliché. "Declan, who is this?" Cassie demanded, her voice sharp. She was not a woman who liked being ignored or looked down upon. Declan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His brain, usually so quick and decisive, was short-circuiting. His two worlds had just collided with the force of a particle accelerator, and he was at ground zero. Gemma answered for him. "I'm his wife," she said simply, the words landing with the finality of a judge's gavel. Cassie's face went white. Wife Declan had told her he was in a loveless, sexless marriage of convenience, a business arrangement. He'd said they were practically separated, living in different wings of the house. He had certainly never mentioned that his estranged wife was carrying his child. She stared at Gemma's belly and the entire fantasy she'd built of a future as the next Mrs. Arlington began to fissure. The air grew thick and suffocating. Nearby diners began to notice their conversations faltering. This was better than theatre. What happened next? Nobody expected. Gemma didn't scream or cry or throw a drink. She simply pulled over an empty chair from a nearby table, the legs scraping softly against the polished floor, and sat down at the head of their booth. She was calm, composed, and utterly terrifying. She looked at the waiter who was hovering nearby, with a deer-in-the-headlights expression. "I seem to have lost my appetite for the wine," she said, her voice even. "Could you please bring me a bottle of still water and a glass for my husband's guest?" She gave Cassie a thin, brittle smile. "You must be thirsty. It takes a lot of energy to climb." The insult was so elegantly delivered that it took Cassie a moment to even register the sting. Declan looked like he was about to have a coronary. "Gemma, please, let's not do this here. Let's go home and talk." "Go home," she laughed, a short, bitter sound, devoid of any humour. "You mean the home where our son's nursery is waiting for him? The home I have been managing while you've been merging." She leaned forward, the full force of her presence directed at him. "No, I think we'll do this, right here, in our restaurant, at our table, or at least near it." She turned her attention back to Cassie, her demeanour shifting from icy fury to a strange, almost clinical curiosity. "Tell me," she began, "what version of his life has he sold you? Am I the frigid, career-obsessed wife who doesn't understand him? Or perhaps the sickly, unstable one he stays with out of pity? He tends to rotate those two." Cassie was flustered, blindsided by the attack. He loves me." She stammered the word, sounding weak and hollow, even to her own ears. "Does he?" Gemma's eyebrow arched. "Did he love you this morning when he kissed my stomach and told his son he couldn't wait to meet him? Did he love you when he approved the designs for the new family wing at our summer estate in the Hamptons? You see, the problem with Declan is that his love is a commodity. He invests it where he thinks he'll get the highest return." She then did something that shattered Declan's composure completely. She reached into her clutch and pulled out the small, beautifully wrapped gift box. She slid it across the table until it stopped in front of his plate. "Happy anniversary, darling," she said, her voice dripping with poison. 8 years since our first date. Here. You forgot, but I didn't." Declan stared at the box as if it were a bomb. The public setting, the anniversary, the pregnancy, it was a perfect storm of his own making, and Gemma was now the conductor. He was no longer the master of the universe. He was a trapped animal, and his wife was the hunter who had just closed the cage door. The romantic dinner was over. The trial had just begun. The silence that followed Gemma's pronouncement was a physical entity. It pressed in on them heavy and absolute. The gift-wrapped box sat between the three of them like a judgment. Declan couldn't bring himself to touch it. To do so would be to admit everything, to validate the entire horrifying scene. Cassie stared at the box, then at Gemma's serene, implacable face. Anniversary. The word echoed in her mind. Declan had told her tonight was special, a celebration of them. He had lied. It wasn't about her at all. She was just a prop in his desecration of a memory. The $1 million necklace suddenly felt like a cheap trinket, a vulgar payment for services rendered. Humiliation, hot and sharp, coursed through her. She wasn't his future. She was his dirty little secret. I don't believe this, Cassie said, finding her voice, which was now laced with a tremor of fury. She turned on Declan. An anniversary. You brought me here on your anniversary with your pregnant wife, Cassie. Just listen. Declan started reaching for her, but she recoiled. Don't touch me, she hissed. Have you no shame? No decency. Gemma watched the exchange with a detached calm like a scientist, observing rats in a maze of her own design. Oh, he has no shame, she interjected smoothly. Shame is for people with a conscience. Declan has a balance sheet. Isn't that right, darling? Everything is a calculated risk. I imagine I was low-risk stable returns, while she gestured dismissively at Cassie was your high-risk volatile asset. The business terminology, their private language being used to describe his infidelity, was a new level of evisceration. It stripped the affair of any romance or passion he had ascribed to it and exposed it for what it was, a transaction. Declan finally broke. He slammed a fist on the table, making the silverware jump. Enough, Gemma. This is not the place. This is the perfect place, she retorted, her voice rising for the first time, not in a shout, but in a crescendo of controlled power. You chose to disrespect me, our marriage, and our unborn child in public. So you will be held accountable in public. I want her to see you for who you are. Not the charming billionaire, but a weak, deceitful man who hides behind his money. She stood up, her regal composure fully restored. The scene had served its purpose. She had not come for a screaming match. She had come to reclaim her power to detonate the bomb and walk away from the blast zone. Enjoy your meal, she said, her voice, once again a soft, chilling whisper. She looked directly at Cassie, a flicker of something that might have been pity in her eyes. And the necklace is lovely. I'm sure it will fetch a fair price. You'll probably need it. With that, she turned and walked away. She didn't look back. She navigated the tables with the same grace with which she had arrived, a queen abdicating a corrupt throne. As she passed the Mistress station, Antoine simply inclined his head, his professional mask hiding a deep respect. He had seen a lot in his years at l'Étoile Filante, but he had never seen a public humiliation executed with such devastating elegance. The moment Gemma was out of sight, the spell broke. Cassie pushed her chair back violently. I'm leaving. Cassie, wait. Declan said, grabbing her arm. Let go of me. She wrenched her arm free, her eyes blazing with tears of rage and shame. It's over, Declan. Whatever this was, it's over. You lied to me. About everything. She began to unclasp the diamond necklace, her fingers fumbling with the catch. Don't be ridiculous, just calm down and let's talk somewhere private. No. She finally got it undone and threw the necklace onto the table. It landed with a clatter next to the anniversary gift, a vulgar pile of diamonds next to a symbol of betrayed loyalty. She was right. I was a transaction. Keep your severance package." She stormed out of the restaurant, leaving Declan alone at the table, surrounded by the wreckage of his evening. The other diners were now openly staring, whispering behind their menus. He was the center of a scandal, the villain in a drama that was unfolding for their entertainment. He could feel their judgment, their pity, their morbid curiosity. Declan Arlington, master of the universe, was now just a common cheat who'd been caught. He stared at the two items on the table, the glittering necklace and the quiet, tasteful gift box. With trembling hands, he reached for the box. He tore off the paper and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was the Patek Philippe watch. Engraved on the back were the words, "For our family, for our future. All my love, G." A wave of nausea washed over him. It wasn't just an anniversary gift. It was a statement of faith, a belief in a future he had just incinerated. Gemma made it to the car before the facade cracked. The moment the door was closed, sealing her inside the soundproof bubble of the Rolls-Royce, the first sob tore from her throat. It was a ragged, guttural sound of pure agony. The calm, the control, the icy rage, it all melted away, leaving behind the raw, bleeding wound of betrayal. She curled in on herself, as much as her pregnant body would allow, her hands wrapped around her stomach, as if to shield her baby from his father's sins. The tears came in a torrent, hot and endless. She cried for the man she had fallen in love with 8 years ago, for the marriage she had fought so hard to preserve, and for the innocent child who would now be born into a broken home. Her phone buzzed. It was Phoebe. She answered, unable to speak, her sobs the only sound. "Jen, oh my God, Jen, what happened? Are you okay?" "He was there." Phoebes, she choked out between gasps. "He was there, with her. On our anniversary. She couldn't finish the sentence. "Where are you?" "I'm coming to get you." "No, I'm in the car. I'm coming to your place. I can't go home." "Not to that house. Of course. I'll be waiting. We'll figure this out, Jen. I promise. We'll figure this out." But as Gemma hung up, staring at the blurred city lights through her tear-filled eyes, she knew some things couldn't be figured out. They could only be survived. Declan, meanwhile, sat in the ruins of his date. He'd paid the bill in cash, an absurdly large amount, desperate to flee. He walked out into the cool night air, the watch box heavy in his pocket. He tried to call Cassie, but the call went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail. She had blocked him. He then tried to call Gemma. The phone rang once, twice, then was silenced. She wasn't sending him to voicemail. She was actively rejecting his call. The finality of it was more terrifying than any shouting match. He got into his own car and drove not home, but to his office. The Arlington Tower, a monument to his power and success, felt different tonight. It felt like a tomb. He went up to the penthouse floor, the city lights sprawling beneath him. He had always found this view invigorating, a symbol of his dominion. Tonight, it just made him feel small and utterly alone. He poured himself a large scotch and sank into his leather chair. The reality of his situation was beginning to dawn on him. This wasn't a simple affair that could be smoothed over with an apology and a new piece of jewelry. The public nature of the confrontation, Gemma's pregnancy, the sheer, calculated cruelty of his actions, it was a perfect storm. And he hadn't even begun to consider the biggest complication of all. Gemma wasn't just his wife. She was a Harrington. Her father, Robert Harrington, was a titan of industry, a ruthless old-school patriarch who had single-handedly built a global logistics empire. Robert hadn't just approved of Declan, he had propped him up. Harrington Logistics was the primary partner for all of Arlington Corp's international shipping. More than that, Robert Harrington personally held a 15% stake in Arlington Corp, a wedding gift to ensure his daughter's husband was well supported. He was a silent but immensely powerful member of the board. Declan's blood turned to ice. He hadn't just humiliated his wife. He had declared war on Robert Harrington. The fallout from this wouldn't be a messy divorce. It would be a corporate extinction event. His phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID flashed a name that made his heart stop. Robert Harrington. He stared at it, his hand hovering over the phone, paralyzed by a fear he hadn't felt since he was a child. He had not only lost his wife, he had very likely just lost his empire. Declan let the call from Robert Harrington go to voicemail. It was an act of pure cowardice, and he knew it. A moment later, a text message appeared. It contained no words, just a single ominous summons. My office. 8 a.m. tomorrow. Don't be late. The lack of threats was more terrifying than any tirade. It was the calm, quiet command of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. Declan felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This was no longer a marital dispute. It was a hostile takeover of his life. He spent a sleepless night at his office, alternating between pacing the floor, drinking scotch, and rehearsing speeches that sounded pathetic and hollow even to himself. He tried calling Gemma again and again, but the calls were rejected every time. By dawn, he looked like a ghost of his former self, disheveled, red-eyed, and reeking of fear. Meanwhile, at Phoebe's apartment, Gemma had cried herself to exhaustion. Phoebe had tucked her into bed, fielding calls from a frantic Mrs. Arlington Sr., and of course from Gemma's father. "She's safe with me, Robert," Phoebe had said, keeping her voice low. "She's sleeping now. Just be there for her tomorrow." "I'll do more than that," Robert Harrington's voice had replied, cold as steel. "That boy has forgotten who his wife is. I'm about to remind him." When Gemma awoke, the sun was streaming through the window. For a blissful second, she forgot. Then the memory of the restaurant, of Declan's face, of the other woman, came rushing back, and the pain was as fresh and sharp as it had been hours before. But something had shifted in the night. The despair was still there, but it was now overlaid with a crystalline, diamond-hard resolve. She wasn't just a victim. She was a Harrington, and she was a mother. Phoebe came in with a cup of tea. "Your father called. He wants Declan in his office at 8. Gemma nodded, taking the cup. Her hands were steady. "Good. What are you going to do?" She took a slow sip, letting the warmth spread through her. "First, I'm calling my lawyer, the best divorce attorney in the country. Second, I'm calling my OB-GYN for an emergency checkup to make sure the stress hasn't harmed the baby. And third," she looked at Phoebe, her eyes clear and determined, "I'm going to my father's office. I won't be in the room. But I want to be there when Declan comes out. I want him to see me." At precisely 8 a.m., Declan walked into the Lion's Den. The offices of Harrington Logistics were the opposite of his own sleek, modern tower. They were old-world power, dark wood, thick carpets that absorbed all sound, and walls covered with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. Robert Harrington was waiting for him in his cavernous office, not behind his desk, but standing by the large window, overlooking the financial district, his back to the door. He was a tall, imposing man, in his late 60s, with a full head of silver hair and an aura of absolute authority. "Robert, why?" Declan began. "Sit," Robert said, without turning around. It wasn't a request. Declan sat in one of the leather chairs facing the desk, feeling like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. Robert turned slowly, his face an unreadable mask of granite. "I received a call from my daughter at 2 o'clock this morning." She was hysterical. "Do you have any idea what extreme stress can do to a woman in her 3rd trimester? To my grandson, I am so sorry. It was a terrible mistake, a moment of, do not insult my intelligence by calling this a mistake." Robert cut him off, his voice dropping to a low growl. A mistake is a typo in a report. A mistake is taking the wrong turn on the highway. What you did was a calculated act of profound disrespect to my daughter, to my family, and to the sanctity of the vows you took. He walked to his desk and sat down, folding his hands. When I consented to your marriage with Gemma, I did so under the assumption that you were a man of character, that you understood what she was worth. Clearly, I was wrong. I overestimated you. Declan felt his throat tighten. I love Gemma. I can fix this. Robert actually laughed, a harsh, humorless bark. Love, you don't know the meaning of the word. You know about acquisitions, about leverage, about assets. You saw my daughter as your most valuable asset, the one that secured you an alliance with me. And you devalued her. In business, when an asset underperforms so spectacularly, we divest. The word hung in the air. Divest. The 15% of Arlington Corp that I hold, Robert continued, his voice dangerously calm, is held in a trust that stipulates it is contingent upon your continued good standing as Gemma's husband and the father of her child. My lawyers are currently reviewing the moral turpitude clause. I believe your very public philandering qualifies. Declan's world tilted on its axis. You would torpedo my company, your own investment. My investment was in my daughter's happiness, you arrogant fool. The money is irrelevant. You have failed to deliver a return. So I'm pulling my capital. I'm also instructing the board of Harrington Logistics to begin reviewing our partnership contracts with Arlington Corp. We will be exploring alternatives. This was it. The corporate death sentence. Losing the Harrington contracts would be a catastrophic blow, sending his company's stock into a nosedive. A public battle with Robert Harrington would make him radioactive to other investors. You can't, Declan whispered, the words catching in his throat. I can, Robert said, standing up. The meeting was over. You have 48 hours to get your affairs in order. I suggest you find a very good lawyer. Now get out of my office. You are no longer welcome in my building or in my family. Numb Declan staggered to his feet and walked out of the office. The long corridor seemed to stretch into infinity. As he reached the elevator bank, he saw her. Gemma was standing there talking quietly with Phoebe. She was dressed not in a morning gown, but in a crisp, cream-colored maternity pantsuit. She looked strong, professional, and completely in control. Their eyes met. In his, there was desperation, pleading regret. In hers, there was nothing, a complete and total absence of feeling. It was as if she were looking at a stranger, a piece of furniture, something so insignificant it barely registered. That look was more devastating than any tears or screams. It was the look of absolute erasure. He had ceased to exist for her. The elevator doors opened and he stumbled inside. As the door slid shut, the last thing he saw was his wife turning her back on him, a final, silent dismissal. But the day of reckoning was far from over. As Declan's car sped away, another was pulling up to the curb outside Cassie Reed's apartment building. Cassie, who had also had a sleepless night, was packing a suitcase. Her plan was to disappear to lick her wounds, maybe fly to Europe and try to forget the whole humiliating affair. Her buzzer rang. Thinking it might be a delivery, she answered it. "Who is it, a package for Cassandra Reed?" a polite female voice replied. Confused, Cassie buzzed her in. A few moments later, there was a knock on her door. She opened it to find a woman in a sharp business suit holding a sleek tablet. "Cassandra Reed?" the woman asked. "Yes. My name is Jessica Croft. I'm from the legal department at Harrington Logistics." Cassie's blood ran cold. I don't understand." "It's quite simple," Jessica said with a chilly smile. We were doing a standard background check on individuals associated with Declan Arlington, and your name came up. And a few interesting things came up with it. It seems the luxury apartment you're living in was paid for by a shell corporation. A shell corporation funded directly from a Arlington Corp discretionary account. An account meant for corporate travel and entertainment, not personal acquisitions. Jessica held up the tablet, showing a flowchart of money transfers. This is embezzlement and fraud, using corporate funds for personal gain without board approval. It's highly illegal. Cassie felt faint. That's between Declan and his company. It has nothing to do with me. On the contrary, Jessica replied, her smile tightening. You are the recipient of embezzled funds. That makes you an accessory. We've also found the car, the jewelry, the trips. It all came from the same account. Robert Harrington is prepared to press federal charges. The scandal would be enormous. Arlington Corp would collapse, and you, Ms. Reed, would be facing jail time. Cassie leaned against the doorframe, her legs threatening to give out. What? What do you want? An alternative? Jessica's voice was smooth as silk. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement, so airtight you won't be able to say the name Arlington or Harrington in your sleep. You will return every single item of value Declan Arlington ever gave you, including the funds for this apartment. And you will disappear. In return, Mr. Harrington will consider the matter closed and will not press charges. She slid a thick document from her briefcase. You have 1 hour to have your lawyer review this. I suggest you use the time wisely. Cassie stared at the document, her dream of a billionaire lifestyle turning into a nightmare of federal prison. She had thought she was playing a game of hearts. She now realized she had stumbled onto a battlefield, and she was nothing more than collateral damage in a war between titans. Her choice was no choice at all. The first blow landed not with a shout, but with the quiet, authoritative thud of the morning paper on his penthouse doorstep. Declan, who hadn't slept, saw the headline through the viewport of his tablet before he even touched the physical copy. It was the Wall Street Journal, and his name was at the center of a story that was about to unravel his universe. The headline was clinical, brutal, and perfectly crafted for maximum damage. Arlington Corp under scrutiny for misuse of corporate funds. CEO Declan Arlington implicated. His blood turned to ice. It wasn't about the affair. That would have been a tabloid scandal. This was an attack on his competence, his integrity, his very identity as a titan of industry. The article laid out with surgical precision the web of shell corporations and discretionary accounts. It detailed the flow of money with a clarity that could only have come from an inside source with access to everything. Robert Harrington's fingerprints were all over it. Declan's frantic calls to his PR chief went unanswered for a full 10 minutes, and when the man finally picked up, his voice was strained. We're in damage control, Declan, but this is a 5-alarm fire. The leak is too clean, too detailed. We're getting slaughtered. The second blow followed within the hour. As the market opened, a press release from Harrington, Logistics, hit the wire services. It was a masterpiece of corporate warfare, a single paragraph announcing the immediate termination of all partnership contracts with Arlington Corp, citing a fundamental loss of confidence in their corporate governance and leadership. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. He watched on the financial news network as the ticker for Arlington Corp BCP turned into a waterfall of red. The stock, his legacy, his birthright, was in a free fall. It plunged 60% in pre-market trading and only accelerated downward after the opening bell. His phone lit up with calls from panicked board members, but he knew they weren't calling for reassurance. They were gathering their forces for an execution. The emergency board meeting was convened for noon. When Declan walked into the boardroom on the 50th floor, the atmosphere was glacial. These were men he'd known his whole life, men who had played golf with his father. Today they looked at him as if he were a stranger, a liability that had to be neutralized. Their faces were masks of grim resolve. "Declan Ork," said Lawrence Shaw, the eldest board member, and his father's once closest friend, "this is a catastrophe. You've exposed this company to federal investigation and shareholder lawsuits. Your personal indiscretions have become a material threat to this entire organization. Lawrence, this is a targeted attack from Harrington." Declan pleaded, his voice sounding hollow in the cavernous room. "We can fight this. We can issue a statement." A statement, another board member scoffed. "Declan, your credibility is zero. The time for statements is over. The time for decisive action is now." The vote was a mere formality, a public ritual of his dethronement. The language was cold and legalistic, invoking clauses of moral turpitude and gross negligence. Within an hour of entering the room, Declan Arlington was no longer CEO, no longer chairman, and was forced to tender his immediate resignation from the board of the company that bore his name. He walked out of the boardroom in a daze, his security pass already deactivated. An assistant he barely recognized handed him a cardboard box containing the few personal items from his desk. As he walked through the bustling office floor, the place that had been his kingdom, a sudden silence fell. No one would meet his eye. They stared at their screens, at their papers, anywhere but at the fallen emperor, being escorted from his own palace. He retreated to the vast, empty penthouse. The silence there was heavier, more profound. It was the silence of failure. Days bled into a week, each one punctuated by another sterile, devastating email from his lawyers. Gemma had filed for divorce. Her petition was airtight, citing his very public infidelity. The prenuptial agreement, a document he had once boasted was ironclad, was now revealed to be a finely wrought cage of Harrington design. Its infidelity clause was merciless. "She gets the penthouse," Declan, his lawyer, explained over the phone, his voice devoid of sympathy. "She gets the Hamptons estate. She gets primary custody of the child, and you will pay a significant amount in support. Furthermore, she is entitled to a settlement that includes a large portion of your personal stock portfolio." The lawyer paused. "My advice, don't fight it. Robert Harrington is playing for keeps. He will bury you. Sign the papers. Salvage what little you have left." Amidst the legal carnage, another ghost from his past vanished. He received a small insured package containing a single key, the key to Cassie Reed's apartment. There was no note. His lawyer later confirmed that she had signed a formidable NDA and returned every gift of value. She had been a casualty, a piece swept from the board in a game she never knew she was playing. He felt a fleeting pang of something, not love, but a shared sense of ruin before his own self-pity consumed it. She had an escape route. He did not. 2 months later, in the quiet, sterile wing of a private hospital, Gemma held her son for the first time. As the baby, wrapped in a soft white blanket, was placed in her arms, a wave of love so profound and overwhelming washed over her that it cleansed the last traces of her old life's pain. He was perfect. He had her eyes and a stubborn tuft of dark hair. Looking at his tiny, innocent face, she knew with absolute certainty that her future was right here in her arms. "He needs a name," Phoebe whispered from her side, tears in her eyes. Gemma smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached deep into her soul. "Spencer," she said softly. "Spencer Harrington Arlington." She kept her husband's name for her son, for it was part of his story, but she placed her own family name before it, like a shield, a declaration of where his true strength, his true loyalty, and his true heritage would lie. Declan was a name on a document. Harrington was a legacy of survival and power. The divorce was finalized without fanfare. Gemma, now independently and immensely wealthy, moved with a quiet purpose that awed everyone around her. She didn't retreat into a life of leisure. Instead, she took a leading role at the Harrington Foundation, channeling her intellect and newfound resilience into philanthropic work. She wasn't just writing checks. She was on the ground, championing causes for single mothers and underprivileged children, her empathy forged in the fires of her own ordeal. She was no longer a beautiful accessory to a powerful man. She was power itself, redefined on her own terms. Declan, in contrast, learned to live with the constant low-grade humiliation of his new reality. He was still a rich man, but the currency he had truly valued, power, influence, respect, was gone. He operated a small private equity firm out of a nondescript office, his name a permanent stain that kept him out of the circles he once commanded. He became a ghost in the city that was once his playground, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. Almost a year to the day, after that night at L'Étoile Filante, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Declan found himself walking aimlessly through Central Park. The air was cool, the leaves were turning, and the world felt peaceful in a way his own life was not. And then he saw her. Across a sun-dappled lawn, Gemma was pushing Spencer in a stroller, laughing at something Phoebe had said. She knelt down to adjust Spencer's blanket, her movements full of a tender, unhurried grace. He saw the curve of her smile, the easy joy in her posture, the vibrant life radiating from her and their son. It was a perfect, self-contained world of happiness, a world he had been invited to share and had carelessly burned to the ground. He stood frozen in the shade of an old oak tree, a spectator watching a life he was meant to be living. He was close enough to see the color of her coat, to see Spencer wave a tiny, chubby hand in the air. A desperate, foolish urge to call out to her, to explain, to beg rose in his throat, but it died before it could form a sound. Just then, Gemma looked up, her gaze sweeping across the field. For a single heart-stopping second, her eyes passed directly over him. He saw no flicker of recognition, no flash of anger, no hint of lingering pain. He saw nothing. It was the detached, indifferent glance one gives a stranger, a tree, a part of the scenery that holds no meaning. In that moment, he ceased to be her betrayer, her ex-husband, or the father of her child. He was simply an object in her field of vision, utterly irrelevant. He understood then the true nature of his punishment. It wasn't the loss of his company or his fortune. It was this complete and eternal erasure. He had made himself so small in her life that he had finally irrevocably disappeared, and he was left with nothing but the ashes of his empire and the ghost of a future he had so thoroughly destroyed. And so Declan Arlington's world, built on a foundation of lies, came crashing down. He learned the hard way that a business empire is no match for a woman's resolve, and that some debts can never be repaid with money. Gemma, on the other hand, emerged from the ashes, not as a victim, but as a victor. She transformed her pain into power, building a new life for herself and her son, proving that the greatest strength is not in holding on, but in knowing when to let go and rebuild stronger than before. This story is a powerful reminder that our choices have consequences that can ripple out and change everything. What did you think of Gemma's incredible strength? Was Declan's downfall justified? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a story of justice and resilience. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life dramas. Thank you for listening. The cold, sterile air of the courtroom did little to chill the spectacle unfolding within. It wasn't the divorce itself that had the gossips whispering, it was the audacity. Richard Sterling, a titan of the tech industry, didn't just show up to dissolve his 20-year marriage. He made an entrance. On his arm was not a lawyer, but a woman half his age, her hand possessively intertwined with his. They walked not with shame, but with the triumphant air of victors claiming their spoils. Across the room, his wife Catherine sat alone, a study in quiet grey, seemingly already defeated. But in the silent halls of justice, victory is not decided by the loudness of one's arrival, but by the devastating power of the truth waiting to be spoken. The polished oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a soft, expensive sigh, a sound completely at odds with the jarring image that entered. Richard Sterling, founder and CEO of the tech behemoth Innovate Dynamics, strode in as if he were entering a boardroom to announce record profits. He was a man sculpted by success, from his custom-tailored Brioni suit to the confident, predatory smile that never quite reached his eyes. He radiated an aura of untouchable power, the kind that assumed the world would bend to his will simply because he demanded it. But it was the woman attached to his arm that drew the collective sharp intake of breath from the gallery. Chloe Vance, a social media influencer whose fame was as manufactured as her dazzlingly white teeth, clung to him. Her dress was a vibrant splash of scarlet in the somber room, a deliberate provocation. Her hand resting on his arm was adorned with a canary diamond, so large it seemed to pull her wrist down. They were a portrait of defiant indiscretion, a living, breathing testament to the reason everyone was gathered here today. Across the aisle, Catherine Sterling sat with a stillness that was almost unnatural. If Richard and Chloe were a raging fire, she was a pool of still deep water. Her charcoal grey suit was elegant but unremarkable. Her hands were clasped loosely in her lap, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. To the casual observer, she was the very picture of the scorned, discarded wife. The press had already written the narrative, Catherine the quiet homemaker, the supportive spouse who had been foundational in the early days, but had long since become a relic, an accessory Richard had outgrown. He was the visionary, the genius. She was Mrs. Sterling. Richard's lawyer, Jonathan Davenport, a man whose reputation was as sharp and merciless as his starched collar, gave a curt nod. He'd already assured Richard this would be a formality. A clean cut, he'd said over a $500 lunch. We offer her a settlement so generous it will make her look greedy if she refuses. The house a handsome alimony for a few years, a fund for the children's education. She walks away comfortable and you walk away free. The company is untouchable. It's in your name. It's your creation. Richard believed him, of course. Why wouldn't he innovate dynamics? Was his life's work. He'd conceived it, bled for it, worked 100-hour weeks to build it from a garage startup into a multi-billion-dollar global enterprise. Catherine had been there, yes. She'd made coffee. She'd kept the house running. She'd raised their 2 children. She had played her part, the part of a wife. Now her part was over. He felt a flicker of something, not guilt, but perhaps annoyance at the necessity of this public charade. He wanted to get it over with and start the next chapter of his life with Chloe, a woman who understood the man he was now, not the struggling dreamer he had been. He caught Catherine's eye across the courtroom. He expected to see tears, anger, maybe even pleading. Instead, her gaze was steady, her blue eyes as calm and clear as a winter sky. It was unnerving. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of finality of dismissal. She didn't react. The bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise for the Honourable Judge Annalise Robertson." Judge Robertson entered a woman in her late 50s with a stern countenance that promised no tolerance for theatrics. She took her seat, her eyes sweeping over the room, pausing for a fraction of a second on Richard and Chloe's joined hands before settling on the legal teams. "We are here today to hear the preliminary motions in the divorce proceedings of Sterling versus Sterling." She began, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Mr. Davenport, you may begin." Davenport rose, his movements smooth and practiced. "Your Honor, we are here to expedite a painful process. My client, Mr. Richard Sterling, is prepared to offer a most generous settlement to dissolve his marriage to Mrs. Sterling. He acknowledges her contributions as a wife and mother. As such, he is offering the marital home in Greenwich, valued at $12 million, an alimony payment of $50,000 per month for a period of 5 years, and fully funded trust accounts for their 2 children. In exchange, he asks for a clean break with no further claims on his personal or business assets, specifically his company Innovate Dynamics." He said the name of the company with a certain reverence, as if it were a sovereign kingdom. He made it sound as though Richard were bestowing a great gift upon Catherine, an act of unparalleled charity. Richard smirked, leaning over to whisper something in Chloe's ear, who then giggled softly, a sound that was grotesquely loud in the silent room. Judge Robertson's eyes narrowed slightly at the sound. She turned her attention to the other table. "Mr. Hayes, your response." Catherine's lawyer, Finian Hayes, stood. He was the antithesis of Davenport. Where Davenport was sleek and polished, Hayes was rumpled and academic. He looked more like a history professor than a high-powered litigator. He adjusted his spectacles, his movements deliberate. "Your Honor," Hayes began, his voice calm and even, "we thank Mr. Sterling for his offer." He let the word hang in the air, infusing it with a subtle irony. "However, we must reject it in its entirety. It seems Mr. Sterling and his counsel are operating under a significant misapprehension regarding the ownership of the assets in question." Davenport scoffed audibly. "A misunderstanding, Your Honor. The founding documents of Innovate Dynamics are a matter of public record. Richard Sterling is the founder, the chairman, and the CEO." "Indeed," Hayes replied, his voice never rising. "He is all of those things. But a title is not the same as a title deed. My client is not seeking a piece of Mr. Sterling's company." He paused, letting the silence stretch, drawing the focus of every person in the room. "She is simply here to retain what is already hers." A confused murmur rippled through the gallery. Richard's smile tightened at the edges. What was this game? This was posturing a desperate last-ditch attempt to squeeze more money out of him. He felt a surge of anger. How dare she, after everything he had given her, try to tarnish his name and lay claim to his empire? He squeezed Chloe's hand, a silent reassurance that this was merely a pathetic delay of the inevitable. The stage was set. The lines were drawn, and in his mind, the final act had already been written. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. 22 years ago, there was no Innovate Dynamics. There was no Greenwich Mansion or Brioni suit. There was just a cramped third-floor walk-up apartment in Palo Alto that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and ozone from an overworked computer. There was Richard Sterling, a man with a wildfire of ambition in his belly and a head full of revolutionary ideas about data compression algorithms. And there was Catherine Mallory, a quiet, brilliant software engineer who had just graduated top of her class from MIT with a dual degree in computer science and applied mathematics. They had met at a university tech symposium. Richard was the charismatic speaker painting grand visions of the future on a whiteboard. Catherine was the attendee in the third row, who after his talk approached him, not with fawning praise, but with 3 pointed questions that identified the fundamental flaws in his proposed architecture. Richard, to his credit, was intrigued rather than insulted. He saw in her a mind that was sharper and more systematic than his own. He was the dreamer. She was the architect who could build the scaffolding for those dreams. Their courtship was a whirlwind of code and takeout cartons. Their love language was beta testing and debugging. While Richard could charm investors and articulate a vision, it was Catherine who spent sleepless nights writing the elegant foundational code that would become the company's cornerstone. The first proprietary algorithm, the one that could compress massive data files to a fraction of their size with zero loss of integrity, wasn't Richard's brainchild. It was Catherine's. She'd conceived it for her graduate thesis. When Richard proposed marriage, he also proposed a business partnership. "You and me, Kate," he'd said, his eyes alight with genuine fervor. "We'll change the world. I'll be the face, the salesman. You can be the genius behind the curtain, where you're most comfortable." Catherine, who loathed public speaking and the glad handing of corporate politics, readily agreed. She loved him, and she loved the work. It seemed like a perfect symbiosis. The issue of funding was the first major hurdle. The venture capitalists they pitched to wanted too much equity, too much control. They wanted to replace Richard as CEO with a seasoned veteran and relegate Catherine to a salaried engineering role. It was Catherine who provided the solution. Her maternal grandmother, a shrewd woman who had invested wisely in pharmaceuticals decades earlier, had left her a substantial inheritance. It wasn't billions, but it was enough. A little over $2 million, sitting in a trust she gained access to on her 25th birthday. "We can fund it ourselves, Rich," she told him one night, spreading the trust documents on their cluttered coffee table. "We can build it our way. No board of directors, no outside interference. Just us." Richard was ecstatic, but there was a condition put in place by Catherine's financially savvy father before he passed away. He had always been wary of Richard's expansive, often reckless ambition. The inheritance was Catherine's alone, and her father had advised her to always protect her personal assets. So when they went to the lawyer's office to innovate dynamics, it was on Catherine's advice, guided by her father's wisdom, that they structured the company in a very specific way. A young hungry lawyer named Finian Hayes, recommended by one of Catherine's professors, drew up the paperwork. "It's simple," Hayes had explained, pointing to the relevant clauses. "The initial $2 million capital injection comes directly from a trust in the sole name of Catherine Mallory. In exchange for this seed capital and the intellectual property rights to her proprietary algorithm, the company will issue 100,000 shares of stock." He slid a second document across the table. This document, the shareholder agreement, allocates those shares to reflect his role as the driving force in business development and to give him the operational title he needs. Mr. Richard Sterling will be allocated 49,000 shares, or 49%. He will be named chairman and CEO. The remaining 51,000 shares, 51%, will be allocated to Mrs. Catherine Sterling in recognition of her full capital contribution and ownership of the core IP. She will be a silent partner. Richard had barely glanced at the numbers. He was looking at the line that named him CEO. That was all that mattered. "A silent partner, exactly," he'd said, beaming at Catherine. "It's just a formality, a piece of paper. We're in this together, 50-50 partners for life." He signed the documents with a flourish. Catherine signed after him, her signature, neat and precise. She knew it wasn't just a formality. It was a fail-safe. A quiet acknowledgement that while she was giving him her heart and her genius, she was holding on to the key. Not because she didn't trust him then. but because she was pragmatic enough to understand that the future was an unwritten page. In the first 5 years, their partnership thrived. Richard's relentless drive built the company's profile, while Catherine's quiet, continuous innovation kept their technology years ahead of the competition. She worked from a home office after their first child, Daniel, was born, and then again after their daughter, Sophie, arrived. She was the company's secret weapon, the unseen engine powering the meteoric rise of Innovate Dynamics. Richard was celebrated on the covers of Forbes and Wired as a lone visionary. He never corrected them. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, he began to believe his own press. "I built this," became his mantra. The "we" of their early days faded from his vocabulary. He started to see Catherine's contributions not as a partnership, but as a supporting role. She was managing the house and kids, which in his mind freed him up to build the empire. He forgot about the late nights she still pulled refining code after the children were asleep. He forgot that the core patents that made their new products possible were filed under her name before being assigned to the company she owned. He forgot the source of the $2 million that had started it all. The distance grew. He spent more time at corporate galas than at the dinner table. His business trips became longer, his explanations vaguer. Then came Chloe Vance, a woman who looked at him with the same awe and adoration the fawning magazine articles did. She saw the titan of industry, not the ambitious young man who once nervously asked a brilliant woman for help with his flawed architecture. When Richard told Catherine he wanted a divorce, his tone was that of a CEO downsizing an underperforming department. It was a business decision. He had outgrown the partnership. "I will see to it that you are well taken care of course," he'd said, standing by the vast window of their living room, not even looking at her. "You won't have to worry about a thing." Catherine had looked at him, the man she had loved, the father of her children, and felt a profound, aching sadness. But beneath the sadness was a foundation of steel she had laid for herself 22 years earlier. She hadn't said a word. She had simply picked up the phone and called the only lawyer whose name she had kept for over 2 decades, Finian Hayes. Back in the courtroom, the air crackled with tension. Davenport, for the first time in his professional life, seemed momentarily thrown. He recovered quickly, his professional outrage masking his surprise. "Your Honor, this is a desperate and frankly insulting tactic," he boomed, his voice resonating with indignation. "Mrs. Sterling is attempting to lay claim to a global corporation based on some vague, unsubstantiated notion of early involvement. The fact remains Mr. Sterling built Innovate Dynamics. His name is synonymous with the brand. Her 20-year absence from the corporate world speaks for itself." Judge Robertson looked at Finian Hayes, her expression impassive. "Mr. Hayes, you made a bold claim. I trust you have more than rhetoric to support it." "I do, Your Honor," Hayes said calmly. He walked to his briefcase and pulled out a single slender folder. He didn't present a mountain of paper. He presented a single sharp spear. "I would like to enter into evidence Exhibit A." He handed a document to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. A copy was delivered to Davenport, who snatched it from the clerk's hand. Richard leaned over to look, his brow furrowed in annoyance. "Exhibit A," Hayes announced to the court, "is a certified copy of a bank draft from the Bank of New York, dated April 12, 2003. It is for the amount of $2,150,000. The draft is drawn from the Mallory Family Trust, of which the sole beneficiary and signatory was, and is, Ms. Catherine Mallory, now Catherine Sterling. The recipient of the draft is a newly incorporated entity by the name of Innovate Dynamics." Davenport's eyes scanned the document. He couldn't refute it. The paper was clear, the bank certification impeccable. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, a seed investment, while appreciated, does not equate to ownership in perpetuity. It was a loan, a spousal contribution to a joint venture. It has been repaid 1,000 times over through the lavish lifestyle Mrs. Sterling has enjoyed. Richard nodded emphatically, relief washing over him. Of course, it was a loan. He'd forgotten the exact details, but that must have been it. A loan, Mr. Davenport, Hayes asked, his voice still placid. There is no loan agreement, no promissory note, no record of any repayment. Because it was not a loan. It was a capital investment, and one does not simply get repaid for a founding investment. One gets equity. He then turned to the judge. Which brings me to Exhibit B. He produced another document. Exhibit B is the United States Patent and Trademark Office filing for patent number 6/7/421, colloquially known as the Sterling compression algorithm. This is the cornerstone technology upon which Innovate Dynamics was built. The patent was granted on October 4, 2003. The sole inventor listed on the application is Catherine Mallory. A low gasp rippled through the gallery. Chloe, who had been looking bored, now sat up straight, her eyes darting from the judge to Richard. Richard's face was turning a dangerous shade of red. It was true, he remembered now. She had to be listed as the inventor for legal reasons, but it was his vision, his project. She was just the coder. A technicality, Davenport sputtered, getting to his feet. Mrs. Sterling assigned this patent to the company, as is standard practice for any employee or founder. It's corporate property. You are correct, Mr. Davenport. She did assign the patent to the company. Hayes agreed with a serene nod. She assigned her intellectual property to the corporate entity. But one must ask, who exactly is the corporate entity? Who owns it? A company is not an abstract concept. It is a legal structure owned by its shareholders. Richard was now vibrating with barely suppressed rage. This was a circus. His private life, his company being dissected by this rumpled, unassuming little man. He leaned forward and hissed at Davenport. "Shut him down, Jonathan. This is ridiculous." Davenport held up a hand to quiet his client. He needed to regain control of the narrative. Your Honor, Mr. Hayes is playing games with semantics. Let's talk about the reality of the last 2 decades. Who has been at the helm of this company? Who has navigated market fluctuations, spearheaded global expansion, and driven shareholder value to astronomical heights? Richard Sterling. Where has Mrs. Sterling been at home? Raising their children. A noble pursuit to be sure, but not one that earns you a stake in a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. The argument seemed to land. It felt like common sense. The man who runs the company owns the company. Hayes waited patiently for Davenport to finish. He let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke. Mr. Davenport paints a compelling picture, he conceded. But the law is not concerned with pictures. It is concerned with facts and documents. Mr. Sterling has indeed been the public face, and the CEO, and my client has never contested his effectiveness in that role. She was, in fact, his biggest supporter. She was content to be the silent partner while she raised their family, knowing her investment, both financial and intellectual, was secure. There is no silent partner, Richard suddenly yelled, unable to contain himself. He shot to his feet, pointing a finger at Hayes. There is no partner. There is me. I built it. Me. Mr. Sterling, control yourself. Judge Robertson's voice cut through the air like a shard of ice. Sit down, now. Another outburst like that, and I will hold you in contempt. Richard, his face a mask of fury, slowly sat down. Chloe placed a placating hand on his arm, but he shook it off. Hayes remained unperturbed by the outburst. He walked back to his briefcase. His movements were slow, deliberate each step, building the suffocating pressure in the room. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in. "Mr. Davenport and his client are correct about one thing. The founding documents of Innovate Dynamics are indeed a matter of public record. They are quite clear, and I believe it's time we all reviewed them together." He pulled out a third folder. It was thicker than the others, bound in a simple blue cover. He didn't introduce it as an exhibit. He simply held it. "This," he said, "is the Articles of Incorporation and the original executed shareholder agreement for Innovate Dynamics, dated April 12, 2003. Signed by both Richard Sterling and Catherine Sterling." He walked over to the defense table and handed a copy to Davenport. Richard grabbed it, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped it open. His eyes raced across the dense legal text, searching for the clause, the line, the single sentence he had dismissed as a formality 2 decades ago. And then he saw it, in black and white, unambiguous, irrefutable. Shareholder allocation, Catherine Mallory Sterling, 1,000 shares, 51%. Richard Sterling got 1,000 shares, 49%. The blood drained from his face. The courtroom, the people, the low hum of the air conditioning, it all faded into a deafening roar in his ears. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a typo. It was the truth, written in ink, sealed by his own arrogant signature. A truth he had managed to forget for 22 years. The silence in the courtroom was a physical entity. It was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the frantic rustle of paper as Richard Sterling read the shareholder agreement again and again, as if hoping the words would magically rearrange themselves. His face, which had been flushed with anger moments before, was now a pale, waxy mask of disbelief. He looked up from the document, his eyes wide with a dawning horror, and stared at Catherine. She met his gaze, and for the first time that day, her expression shifted. There was no triumph, no smug satisfaction. There was only a profound, quiet sorrow. It was the look of a woman who was not winning a war, but simply ending one that had been waged against her in silence for years. Chloe Vance, sensing the seismic shift in the room's atmosphere, leaned closer to Richard. "What is it, Rich? What's wrong?" she whispered, her voice laced with a confusion that was rapidly turning to panic. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Davenport was on his feet, but the usual bluster was gone. He looked like a man who had confidently walked onto a solid-looking bridge only to find it was a hologram. Your Honor, this document, we contest its validity. It's 2 decades old. Subsequent filings, corporate actions. Judge Robertson cut him off, her voice devoid of sympathy. Mr. Davenport, are you suggesting this foundational document has been superseded? Was there ever a corporate action to reissue or reallocate these Class A voting shares, a buyback, a sale? Is there any document filed with the SEC or any other regulatory body that invalidates this shareholder agreement? Davenport opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew as well as she did that there wasn't. Why would there be? Richard, in his supreme confidence, had never seen the need. He ran the company as his personal fiefdom. The board was stacked with his allies, the corporate filings were rubber-stamped. No one had ever thought to question the foundational ownership structure because the CEO, Richard Sterling, had never imagined it was in question. His 49% stake, combined with his force of will, had always been more than enough to maintain absolute control. He'd forgotten that in the cold, hard world of corporate law, will is irrelevant. Only numbers matter. And he was short by 2%. Judge Robertson adjusted her glasses and looked down at the copy of the agreement before her. She read the critical passage aloud, her voice clear and precise, each word a hammer blow against the crumbling edifice of Richard Sterling's world. The allocation of the initial 100,000 shares of Innovate Dynamics Inc. shall be as follows: 51,000 shares to Catherine Mallory Sterling, and 49,000 shares to Richard Sterling. She looked up from the page, her gaze sweeping past the stunned lawyers, past Richard's ashen face, and settling firmly on Catherine. It seems there has indeed been a grave misunderstanding in this courtroom. The judge stated, her tone icy. She then turned her steely eyes directly on Richard, who was still holding hands with his mistress, a detail that had not escaped her notice. She delivered the line that would be on the front page of every financial newspaper by morning. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "it appears you've brought a guest to a private matter concerning corporate assets. This is a divorce proceeding, not a shareholder meeting. However, given that the primary asset in question is Innovate Dynamics, the court must address the controlling party." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle on the room. She turned her full attention to the woman in the simple grey suit. "Mrs. Sterling." The judge's voice was formal, but a new note of respect had entered it. As the documented majority owner and controlling shareholder of Innovate Dynamics, perhaps you would be so kind as to address the court's questions regarding the company's valuation and asset distribution. Mr. Davenport's initial offer seems woefully misinformed. The sound that followed was a collective gasp from the gallery. It was the sound of a narrative being violently, irrevocably shattered. Richard Sterling, the Titan, the visionary, the king, was none of those things. He was a minority shareholder. He was the CIO, yes, but a CIO who served at the pleasure of the board, which in turn served at the pleasure of the majority owner. Catherine. Richard finally let go of Chloe's hand. The contact, once a symbol of his power and freedom, now felt like an anchor pulling him down. He stared at his wife, his quiet, unassuming, forgotten wife, and for the first time, he didn't see the woman who made his coffee or raised his children. He saw the brilliant MIT graduate he'd met 22 years ago. He saw the architect of his success. He saw the queen he had never realized was sitting across the chessboard from him the entire time. Chloe looked from Richard's colorless face to Catherine's composed one, and the brutal reality of the situation finally crashed down on her. The money, the prestige, the power she had attached herself to didn't belong to the man beside her. It belonged to the woman he was trying to discard. Her canary diamond suddenly felt like cheap glass. Her scarlet dress felt garish and foolish. She had bet on the wrong horse, or rather she had fundamentally misunderstood who held the reins. Finian Hayes calmly gathered his papers, his work done. He had not raised his voice, he had not performed for the gallery. He had simply presented the truth, a truth that had been lying dormant in a lawyer's filing cabinet for over 2 decades, waiting for its moment. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. This court will recess for 1 hour to allow counsel to confer in light of this new information, she announced. Mr. Sterling, I suggest you use the time to acquire a clearer understanding of your legal and financial position. As Judge Robertson swept from the room, chaos erupted. Reporters in the gallery scrambled for the doors. Davenport was frantically trying to speak to Richard, who was deaf to the world, his eyes still locked on Catherine. Catherine stood up, her movements fluid and unhurried. She smoothed the front of her suit, picked up her simple leather handbag, and gave a small, polite nod to her lawyer. Without a single glance back at the wreckage of the man she had once loved, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor, the quiet, steady footsteps of the true owner. The 60-minute recess felt like an eternity, and a split second all at once. Richard Davenport and a now very quiet Chloe were ushered into a small windowless conference room. The moment the door clicked shut, Richard's catatonic shock erupted into a volcano of rage. "What is the meaning of this? Jonathan!" He roared, his voice hoarse. He ripped off his tie and threw it on the polished table. "How did you not know? How did I not know? 51%! It's impossible!" Davenport, pale and sweating, fumbled with his own copy of the shareholder agreement. "Richard, my team did the due diligence. We looked at the current corporate structure, the SEC filings. Everything points to you as the controlling figure. This is a foundational document, an oversight of colossal proportions." "An oversight?" Richard laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "An oversight is forgetting to tip the valet, Jonathan. This is not an oversight. This is a public castration. She planned this. That quiet, mousy woman planned this from the very beginning." His mind reeled, replaying 22 years of memories through this new, terrifying lens. Every conversation, every decision. Her insistence on using her inheritance instead of taking on venture capital. Her suggestion to use that quiet little lawyer, Finian Hayes. Her lack of interest in a corporate title. "I'm happy behind the scenes, Rich," she used to say. He'd thought it was modesty, a lack of ambition. Now he saw it for what it was. Strategy. She hadn't wanted a title. She had the one that mattered most, owner. Chloe finally found her voice, a thin, reedy sound. "Richard, what does this mean for us?" He whirled on her, his eyes wild with fury and humiliation. "What does it mean?" he spat. "It means the penthouse you're redecorating isn't mine to give. It means the jet we flew to Aspen on belongs to a company she controls. It means that ridiculous rock on your finger was bought with money from a checking account that she is the majority beneficiary of. That's what it means." Chloe flinched as if struck. The transactional nature of their relationship was suddenly laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the drab room. Her currency had been her youth, her beauty, her adoration of his power, and his power had just been revealed as an illusion. She looked down at her hands, the life she had imagined for herself, the society pages, the charity galas, the title of the second Mrs. Sterling, evaporating like a mirage. Meanwhile, in a much calmer room down the hall, Catherine sat with Finian Hayes, sipping a cup of black tea. Her hands were perfectly steady. "You were magnificent, Finian," she said, her voice soft but firm, "just as I knew you would be." Hayes smiled, a rare and genuine expression. "I simply presented the facts, Catherine. You're the one who had the foresight to establish them 22 years ago. I've often wondered if you knew this day would come." Catherine stared into her teacup for a long moment. "I didn't know," she said truthfully. "But my father taught me to hope for the best and prepare for the worst. I hoped our partnership would last forever. But I prepared for the reality that Richard's ambition might one day consume his loyalty. I never wanted to use this. It was my insurance policy. But when he brought that woman into a court of law, holding her hand as if to erase my 22 years of life with him, he didn't just ask for a divorce. He tried to nullify my very existence. He cashed the policy himself." The hour passed. When they were recalled to the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed entirely. The whispers were louder, the stares more intense. When Richard Davenport and Chloe re-entered, they looked like a defeated army. Chloe had taken a seat in the back of the gallery, physically distancing herself from the man who was no longer her golden ticket. Richard sat heavily at the table, his expensive suit looking rumpled and ill-fitting. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out emptiness. He was no longer a titan. He was just a man in a courtroom, staring down the barrel of a life he had completely misunderstood. Davenport rose his voice, now subdued, all the fight gone out of him. "Your Honor," he began, his voice raspy. "In light of the documents presented, the plaintiff, Mr. Sterling, requests a continuance to review his position." Finian Hayes stood. "Your Honor, we object to a continuance of the divorce proceedings. However," he added, looking at Catherine, who gave a slight nod, "my client is willing to table the discussion of asset division to a later date to be handled privately. We have more pressing matters to attend to." Judge Robertson raised an eyebrow. "And what might those be?" "Mr. Hayes, my client." Hayes announced his voice, carrying a new weight. "In her capacity as the majority shareholder of Innovate Dynamics, has instructed me to inform the court that she will be calling an emergency meeting of the board of directors for 9 a.m. tomorrow morning." A fresh shockwave went through the room. This wasn't just about the divorce anymore. This was a corporate takeover. Hayes continued his words directed at the court, but clearly intended for Richard. "The agenda for the meeting will include a full review of executive leadership, a forensic audit of the last 5 years of corporate expenditures, and a vote on the future of the chairman and CEO position." Richard's head snapped up. It was one thing to lose the divorce. It was another thing entirely to be publicly and professionally executed. He was going to be fired from his own company, by his own wife. The finality of it was absolute. Catherine wasn't just taking back her share. She was taking back her company. She was taking back her life. The gavel fell again, granting the adjournment of the asset discussion. But for Richard Sterling, the true judgment had just been rendered. He was left sitting at the table, a king dethroned in his own court, the echo of the gavel sounding like the slamming of a prison door. The Innovate Dynamics boardroom was on the 50th floor, a glass-encased sanctuary of power overlooking the sprawling city of San Francisco. It was Richard's domain, a room designed to intimidate and impress. The centerpiece was a monolithic slab of polished obsidian that served as a table surrounded by 16 leather chairs. Richard had always sat at the head, the city his backdrop, the master of his universe. That morning, for the first time in 2 decades, the chair at the head of the table was empty when the board members filed in. They were a collection of men and one woman, handpicked by Richard over the years. Allies, friends, men who owed their careers and their fortunes to him. They murmured amongst themselves, clutching their phones which were buzzing with news alerts about the courtroom drama. They were confused, nervous, and loyal to the man who had made them all rich. Richard arrived last 5 minutes before 9. He looked haggard, his face etched with the lines of a sleepless night. He walked not to the head of the table but to a seat on the side, a tacit admission of his new status. The room fell silent. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the boardroom doors opened. Catherine Sterling walked in, followed by Finian Hayes. She was not the somber grey figure from the courtroom. Today she wore a sharply tailored navy blue dress, her hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She carried a leather portfolio and moved with a quiet confidence that filled the room. She was not a wife seeking alimony. She was a shareholder arriving to protect her investment. She walked directly to the empty chair at the head of the table and sat down. She placed her portfolio neatly in front of her and surveyed the faces staring back at her. Some were hostile, some confused, all of them wary. "Good morning, gentlemen, Miss Albright." She began, her voice, calm and steady, amplified slightly by the room's discreet microphone system. "Thank you for attending this emergency meeting on such short notice. I know there are many questions. Let me begin by stating the facts, so we are all operating from the same foundation of truth. She didn't mention the divorce. She didn't mention the affair. She was all business. As has been made public, I am, and always have been, the majority shareholder of Innovate Dynamics. For the past 22 years, I have been a silent partner, content to allow Mr. Sterling to run the day-to-day operations. However, recent events have given me cause for grave concern about the company's governance and a potential misappropriation of corporate funds for personal use. Therefore, I have decided to take a more active role in protecting this company's future. A board member, a long-time friend of Richard's named Gerald Finney, cleared his throat. With all due respect, Catherine, Mrs. Sterling, you've been out of the business world for 2 decades. You can't just walk in here and... Catherine held up a hand and he fell silent. Your respect is noted, Gerald. But your assessment of my involvement is inaccurate. While you may not have seen me in this boardroom, I have never been out of the business. Who do you think wrote the source code for our new Quantum Leap predictive AI? Who do you think holds the 3 key patents that our entire next-generation product line is based on? She let the question hang in the air. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. The company's recent surge in stock price was almost entirely due to the revolutionary quantum leap technology, which everyone had attributed to Richard and the R&D department. Catherine opened her portfolio. I'm not a homemaker who got lucky with a stock certificate, she said, her voice turning to steel. I am the chief architect of this company's core technology, and I have watched from the sidelines as my work has been leveraged to fund a lifestyle of excess and recklessness that is now threatening the company's reputation and financial stability. She slid a file across the table. This is a preliminary review of corporate expense reports from the CEO's office for the last fiscal year. It details over $2 million in client entertainment and travel expenses that appear to have no corresponding business purpose. Private jets to St. Bart's extended stays at the Hôtel de Paris in Monaco, $500,000 in jewelry from a single vendor in New York, all billed to the company. She looked directly at Richard. These are not the actions of a responsible CEO. They are the actions of a man who has forgotten the difference between the company's treasury and his own personal piggy bank. Richard, who had been sitting in stony silence, finally spoke. This is a farce. It's a personal vendetta. Is it, Richard? Catherine countered, her voice dangerously soft. Was it a personal vendetta when you leveraged company assets to secure a personal loan for a $50 million penthouse? Was it a personal vendetta when you put your mistress on the corporate payroll as a brand consultant at a salary of $300,000 a year? The board was stunned into silence. These were details they had never been privy to. Richard's face was ashen. He had been caught, and he knew it. Catherine pressed her advantage. This company is not a toy. It's not a vehicle for one man's ego. It is a corporation with a fiduciary duty to its shareholders, all of them, and its employees. That duty has been neglected. That ends today. She stood up, her presence commanding the room. I am exercising my right as the majority shareholder. I am calling for a vote of no confidence in the current chairman and CEO, Richard Sterling. All in favor. She raised her hand. For a moment there was a stunned silence. Then slowly, one by one, the hands went up. First, Ms. Albright, the sole woman on the board who had always been marginalized by Richard. Then a younger member who was more loyal to the stock price than to the old guard. Then another. They saw the writing on the wall. The power had shifted. Loyalty to Richard was now a liability. Finally, even Gerald Finney, Richard's old friend, reluctantly raised his hand. Richard was left sitting there alone, his hands flat on the obsidian table, as the vote against him became unanimous. "The motion carries," Catherine announced, her voice even betraying no emotion. "Richard, your employment with Innovate Dynamics is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Your personal effects will be sent to you." She then turned to the stunned board. "I am also proposing an interim CEO to guide the company through this transition. Effective immediately, I will be assuming that role. My first act will be to freeze all non-essential executive spending and to initiate a full independent forensic audit. We will reassure our investors, we will refocus our strategy, and we will move forward, stronger and more transparent than before." She stood there at the head of the table, no longer Catherine Sterling, the scorned wife, but Catherine Mallory, the founder, the inventor, and the new CEO. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was a restoration. The Queen, long in exile, had finally taken her throne. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. The story of Catherine Sterling's boardroom coup became a media sensation, a modern-day corporate fairy tale. She was portrayed as a folk hero, a symbol of quiet strength and female empowerment. Magazine covers that once featured Richard's smirking face now ran cover stories on "The Silent CEO" and "The Queen of Code Who Reclaimed Her Kingdom." Catherine ignored the noise. She was not interested in becoming a celebrity. She was interested in running her company. She worked with a quiet, relentless efficiency that both impressed and terrified the old guard at Innovate Dynamics. She didn't rule with Richard's bombastic, ego-driven style. She managed with logic data and a deep, intrinsic understanding of the technology that powered the company. Her first week, she walked the floors of the R&D department, talking to the engineers not as a CEO, but as one of their own. She spoke their language of algorithms and processing power. She identified brilliant, overlooked engineers, many of them women, who had been stifled under Richard's regime, and promoted them to leadership positions. Morale, which had been flagging, began to soar. The employees realized their new leader was not a corporate raider, but the soul of the company they had been missing all along. The forensic audit revealed the true depth of Richard's financial malfeasance. He had been treating the company like his personal ATM for years. Armed with irrefutable proof, Catherine's legal team finalized the divorce. There was no negotiation. There was a settlement. Richard was stripped of his remaining 49% stake in the company as compensation for the funds he had embezzled. He was left with a single personal bank account containing a few $100,000, a fraction of what he had considered pocket change. The Greenwich mansion, which Catherine had never truly felt at home in, was sold. The proceeds were used to set up charitable foundations in her children's names. Richard Sterling, the man who had everything, was left with almost nothing. His name, once a byword for success, was now a cautionary tale. Friends and allies from his former life stopped returning his calls. Chloe Vance had disappeared the day after the first court hearing, her social media accounts suddenly scrubbed of any mention of him. He was alone, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had once been his. Catherine, meanwhile, moved into a tasteful but understated apartment in the city closer to the office. She found that the trappings of wealth Richard had craved meant very little to her. What she loved was the work, the challenge, the act of creation. Her relationship with her children, Daniel and Sophie, who were both in college, transformed. For years they had seen their father as the dynamic, important parent, and their mother as the quiet, background figure. Now they saw her for who she truly was. They visited her at the office, their eyes wide with awe, as they watched her lead a meeting or sketch out a complex system on a whiteboard. They were proud of her not just for what she had won, but for the quiet dignity with which she had won it. 6 months after she took the helm, Catherine stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the boardroom, the same window Richard had used as his backdrop. But she wasn't looking at her reflection in the glass. She was looking at the city lights twinkling to life as dusk fell. The obsidian table behind her was no longer a symbol of one man's ego, but a place of collaboration and innovation. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her daughter, Sophie. "Saw the new stock ticker. Wow, Mom, you're a rock star. Dad who love you." A small smile touched Catherine's lips. There was no bitterness in her heart, no desire for revenge. Richard's downfall was not her victory. It was the consequence of his own choices. Her victory was this, the quiet hum of the servers in the building, below the challenging work that lay ahead tomorrow, and the freedom to define her own legacy. She had not set out to destroy her husband's world. She had simply refused to let him destroy hers. And in doing so, she had built a new one, brighter and more authentic than anything she had left behind. She turned from the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, ready for the next chapter. The story of Catherine Sterling is a powerful reminder that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. It's a testament to quiet strength, long-term vision, and the irrefutable power of a truth written down on paper. She played the long game, not out of malice, but out of a deep-seated wisdom and self-preservation. Her journey from a silent partner to a celebrated CEO resonates with anyone who has ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or had their contributions erased. If Catherine's story of quiet triumph and strategic genius struck a chord with you, let us know in the comments below. What part of her story was the most satisfying? Don't forget to hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own hidden strength, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of justice and empowerment. Thank you for listening.